Good morning and welcome to this special DGAP morning briefing. My name is Tim Hofmann. I am an editor at the magazine Internationale Politik, published by the DGAP. On Saturday, the United States and Israel launched a large-scale attack against Iran's leadership and military. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who had held ultimate power in the country since 1989, was killed, along with several other leading figures of the regime in Tehran. The attack came as negotiations between the US and Iran over a new nuclear deal were still underway, mediated by Oman. After the last round of talks on Thursday in Geneva, President Trump made no secret of his frustration with the lack of progress. A frustration that, as we know now, was sufficient to turn his threats of military action into reality. Iran has retaliated with strikes against Israel as well as American military bases in several Gulf countries. The escalation has effectively closed the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most strategically vital waterways, as well as the airspace across the region. Yesterday saw a dramatic expansion of the war, with casualties and destruction reported across several countries in the region. So clearly, we are witnessing an extremely complex situation that has many layers worth addressing. In today's special morning briefing, we want to make sense of what's happening on the ground. We want to look at the broader international implications, explore possible scenarios for Iran's future, and ask what role Germany and Europe can play in the days and weeks ahead. I'm very grateful to our speakers for joining us at such short notice. First, we have Kabir Taneja, Executive Director of the Observer Research Foundation Middle East in Dubai, a position he has held since January of this year. Kabir focuses on the Middle East, terrorism, and non-state militant actors, and has a background in journalism. We are also joined by Rachel Tausendfreund, Senior Research Fellow here at DGAP since 2024. Before joining DGAP, Rachel spent several years at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. In her work, she covers US domestic and foreign policy as well as transatlantic relations. And finally, we have Dr. Cornelius Adebar, Associate Fellow at DGAP's Europe Center, and an independent consultant and analyst based in Berlin with a focus on European foreign policy and Iran. Before we get started, a few housekeeping notes. This meeting is being recorded and will be uploaded afterwards. As always, we will begin with 5 minutes opening remarks from each speaker, followed by a moderated discussion with questions from the audience. So please have your questions prepared. And if you have a question, please raise your hand or post it in the chat. And I'd also like to thank all my colleagues at DGAP who helped pull this event together at very short notice. And they did so in many different ways, reaching out to speakers, shaping the content, editing and circulating the invitation, and many other things. You know who you are. Thank you. This was really a great team effort. All right, let's dive in. Kabir, let's start with you. We are now 4 days into what looks like a rapidly widening war in the Middle East. Where do things stand right now, and how did we get there? Over to you.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks for the invitation to be here today. I was in Dubai till Friday, so I took one of the last flights out of Dubai before the shutdowns happened and the strikes began. And till about Thursday, Friday, I think there was very limited inclination, at least in the region, that this is going to happen within this time frame. So I think preparation-wise, there was expectation that the amount of military might that the US was amassing across the region would make very little sense if it was not utilized. So there was an expectation that there will be mobilization against Iran, but in what format and in what way was always a question. So I think there are 2-3 critical points that have happened since then. And of course, the first one was the assassination of Ayatollah Khamenei. Which was the game changer. I think that was always going to be a watershed event as far as Iran's response to both the US and the region was concerned, because it mobilized Iran into a country that was negotiating with the US through mediation of Oman, was regularly in touch with Gulf countries, including Qatar, UAE. And recently had normalized with Saudi Arabia, so was doing fairly well comparatively when it comes to the region. But now it's an existential state. Now it's a state that fears that the system that was put in 1979 is under direct and immediate threat, and it must protect it. Hence, we are seeing this response, which is largely coming in the way of drone attacks and gray zone warfare against Gulf states, especially now targeting energy supplies and so on and so forth. We are hearing about Strait of Hormuz being blocked. So this is a regional crisis, an Iranian crisis manifesting as a regional crisis, manifesting as an international crisis. Iran is very clear they don't want to keep this within the construct of Iran and Israel, or Iran and the US and Israel. Because once the Strait of Hormuz is actually blocked, oil prices are definitely going to be something that will be above $100 a barrel. And it's important to understand that sometimes oil prices and managing oil prices is harder than managing oil supplies. For countries specifically in Asia, for example, I'm sitting in Delhi right now, and there's a lot of anxiety about what happens to both supplies and prices in a very price-sensitive market. Iran is basically held by the jugular right now against a wall, and it is going to kick and scream. I think that's a very natural response to a country that is being threatened from an existential point of view, and a system that is being threatened from an existential point of view. What lies ahead will be interesting, because I think the bigger problems that we are facing right now is also having not much clarity on what the American thinking is. If you see the past 24 hours, there are 7 different accounts on what led to this decision that the US should enter this war in the manner that it has. So there are very little policy imperatives and policy clarity for countries outside the region as well to make sense of what is taking place. And I think in the next coming week or week and a half, we may see things get a little bit worse. And the only thing that I can see as an off-ramp at this point of time will be if the anxieties of this becoming a protracted long-term quagmire for the US finally dawns upon the White House. And President Trump is a personality that does not think too much about whether the success matters to his legacy or a failure matters to his legacy. But I think the last point that I'd like to make is that Iran hasn't capitulated. I think that's a very interesting point, that the system that they were hoping to weaken, and they are continuing to hoping to weaken, is sort of resilient till now. It's difficult to say whether on what kind of format it is going to survive in the next month or so. But unlike, let's say, Syria, when Assad called for his soldiers to come and fight and no one turned up, or Afghanistan in 2021 when no one turned up to fight the Taliban marching into Kabul. This is different. This is basically a system saying that we are looking for a protracted conflict if that is inflicted on us. But I'm not sure if anyone in the region or in the international community is ready for one yet. Thank you.
Thank you. You mentioned the American thinking, and we will hear about that in a moment. But let me stay with you for 2 more minutes or so with a follow-up question on the Gulf states. You've mentioned that also. Iranian missiles have hit airports and major buildings across the Gulf, civilian facilities. So yeah, there are spillover effects clearly. So how are the governments there reacting in the countries? Can they stay out of this as they probably wish, or is the pressure to respond becoming too great?
I think look, I think the Iranian thinking was that technology-wise, I think they knew that their drones and their missiles, even though they are available in numbers, will not succeed too much in penetrating Israeli air defenses. That automatically means that political pressure will be unable to be built up against Israel by using kinetic methods. That automatically meant that, unfortunately for the Gulf countries, their proximity to Iran and their centrality to both international economics and international energy security was going to be the last resort. It's the last option in the pitch deck. And once a country like Iran has basically decided to go for that, that automatically means that rationality should not be expected beyond a point from the Iranian system at right now. If you are in, as I mentioned before, if you are in a survivalist mode and your aim is to basically protect the remnants of the political and theological system that have been governing the country since 1979. You will try and make that happen one way or the other. And the Gulf countries, I think, uh, are a bit of a bother because you have to remember that they have very limited experience in fighting wars. They may have very good equipment because, of course, they have money. But the recent example of Kuwait shooting down in a friendly fire incident two or three F-15s shows that they're not very prepared, and they don't have the experience to work in such kind of scenarios in a very professional format. So they're definitely going to require U.S. help. But their other conundrum is that if they do go too close into that bracket in a response to Iran, they will have to ally with Israel as well. And I'm not sure if that's a really good sell within the Arab world as far as public opinion is concerned. Israel is not very popular since the Gaza crisis, and sort of allying against Iran with Israel and the U.S., even if it's the last resort or the last option you have that you can actually utilize. It will not be taken lightly and will have long-term impact and effects on both foreign policy and political thinking.
Thanks, Kabir, for your insights. And you stressed the dilemma that the Gulf countries are facing, and we will definitely come back to that later. But Rachel, turning to you, how do you see the situation from an US perspective? What can you say about, as Kabir put it, the American thinking at this moment, and how has it also changed over the past couple of days and weeks?
So, I mean, Kabir's right. It's not clear what the American thinking on this is, partly because, Trump didn't make the case for war in any kind of way that we're used to in terms of establishing a clear threat and establishing a step of, if not this, then this, and reaching out to allies and kind of the normal procedure, or in fact, seeking congressional approval. And so that leaves sort of the US public not exactly understanding why it needed to come to war and what exactly the goals are and when these goals then might be reached. Part of that is because this isn't a US war, actually. This is an Israeli war that the US is kind of jumping onto and supporting, very actively supporting, more than the 12-day war. But I think that's a really important part of this conundrum for Trump and for the United States, because they're not really leading this charge. And that also means it might be difficult for them if Israel wants to stay in this war longer than the US does. But for now, let's say, this is clearly a very big risk for Trump, but it's a risk that involves a lot to win and a lot to lose. So on the winning side, it's quite clear, that Trump is keen to be the best president ever and put himself in the history books in some way. And being the president who, took down Khamenei is a way to get a spot in the history books of the United States, right? There's been a very long history of Iran hawkishness since 1979 in the hostage crisis, right? So being the president who kind of finally takes on this regime could be a very big win if it's deemed to be somehow successful. And in fact, the fact that they already got Al Khamenei is a way of it being, you could sell it as a success. If this leads to, some kind of nuclear peace deal that looks a lot more like a capitulation than previous deals did, that will be also easily sold as a success. You could imagine it being, maybe something like a Venezuela solution where actually the regime stays in place, but it's got a different guy at the head, and there's some kind of deal that looks like they're more cooperative to the US. And for Trump, he could sell that as a success, maybe differently than other US presidents who would be more worried about the internal situation of Iran and the Iranian people. And also, following on the Venezuela operation that was, deemed highly successful, he could be the president who leaves the US as a place that wins wars again, right? Trump was kind of misunderstood as being really consistently anti-war, but that's actually, or anti-military force. But that's not really true. He's anti-long protracted wars that the US doesn't win, right? He's in favor of short wars that the US wins. Now, how you know you're going to win the war from the very beginning, that turns out to be the tricky part. which leads us to the fact that there's a lot to lose in this, right? We can all remember that it also looked like Iraq was a quick success for George W. Bush, and that turned around pretty quickly. So we already see oil prices spiking, the shipping complications that could lead to a real economic shock. This is in the context of looming midterms. Primaries for these midterms start already next week, where it's very clear that economic troubles and affordability, as it's called, is the number one concern for voters and Republican voters. And so this is a very big risk, less so for Trump than for the Republicans. But if the Republicans lose the House and the Senate, that's also going to be trouble for Trump. As this war continues and gets messy, we have already at least 6 American soldiers dead. And I mentioned already the economic chaos. As this kind of continues and there's talk about war without any big clear success, let's say at the 2-week mark, I think you're already going to see an onset of war fatigue, because Venezuela was really short, so it didn't kind of awaken that. But the American public is still very fatigued from war. And 1 week is one thing, but 2 to 3 weeks, or the 4 to 5 weeks that Trump is talking about, if it's at all messy with any kind of U.S. Loss of life and or economic costs, people are going to get tired really quickly. And then, of course, there's the very real possibility that that this turns into a kind of Libya situation. In fact, the way the U.S. is waging the war is like a Libya situation, which is to say, a very kind of distanced approach with air power, and we'll like take out the leader, but we don't have a plan for what comes next. And so you're looking at all kinds of, economic chaos, refugee situation for important allies like Turkey, all of which I don't think have been, gamed out very specifically by the Trump administration. I mean, certainly the Pentagon has thoughts about this, but I don't think these considerations have been really played in. I think the expectation is this is a 2 to 4 week thing that's going to seem very clean, and the U.S. can come out winning. But that's certainly in no way certain. And so it's a very big risk for Trump.
Speaking of a very big risk, today Chancellor Merz is set to meet Donald Trump. This trip has been planned way in advance and before this all happened, but still the agenda will be overshadowed by the events in the Middle East. How do you expect this crisis to reshape the transatlantic agenda?
It's interesting, right? I mean, first of all, you can see an example of why things that seem like a quick win war are appealing to President Trump, who just suffered a major defeat in his tariff agenda, and his ability to kind of use tariff threats and tariff power as number one means of coercion, right? I mean, he still plans to come up with other solutions, but it's going to be more complicated, and even these other solutions are on shaky legal footing. And that's actually what the Merz visit is really about, kind of this ongoing tariff negotiation. That's what Merz is going to want to talk about. And that situation has gotten a lot more complicated on both sides. Interestingly, the Iran thing is going to be less of an issue. I mean, Merz's statement was already really quite supportive of the Israel and American war against Iran. And I mean, you could say rather dismissive of international law, which, I mean, this invasion really is a very big problem in terms of international law. But, Merz is a president or a chancellor who's maybe a little bit more pragmatic, let's say, on issues of international law than maybe previous chancellors would have been, or different parties in the German system are. So actually, I think that's not going to cause additional difficulty at this state. I mean, it's a problem for Europe in terms of energy supplies, right? And that's difficult. And probably Merz is going to want to bring that up with Trump. And as that continues, that will be an issue of contention in the transatlantic relationship, right? If Europe is paying exorbitantly for the energy issues created by this war, that's going to be a struggle, because Merz also has the same kind of economic problems in Germany that Trump has in the US, electorally as well as in reality. But in this initial visit, I think he's going to be able to say to Trump, you know what, I think this was a pretty good idea, and it's great that you got Khamenei, and sort of it won't cloud this visit, I think, all that much. The real problems will come in about 10 days to 2 weeks.
All right, thank you. Cornelius, I want to turn to Iran itself now. The killing of Ali Khamenei is an extraordinary moment. How stable, from your point of view, is the regime right now? And do you see a realistic path toward regime change? That is the question that is looming over this whole situation at the moment. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thanks to Kabir and Rachel for laying the ground for this discussion. Yes, I'm happy to look at the situation in Iran. Three short points that I would like to make. The first one is the regime per se. The second, the situation of the population. And the third are maybe what you can call prospects of future change. So the regime itself has proven once more to be pretty resilient. It seems that they have prepared well for this particular situation. It had become clear over the past months the regime was expecting a war. In fact, it felt like it was still in a war. We remember that in last June, Israel attacked Iran, the United States joined these attacks, and this has been the mindset ever since. I mean, it's not like Iran hasn't been opposed to the United States and Israel since the foundation of the Islamic Republic in 1979, but it had really become a kind of a fairly open and including military confrontation. So the regime has prepared, as we can see now. They apparently didn't expect such a targeted strike on the supreme leader. Otherwise, he wouldn't have held this meeting with high-ranking military officials on Saturday morning, which the CIA got wind of, and then the Israelis successfully targeted. But what we can see is that there has been the preparations have been made in order to provide at least the semblance of now an orderly succession. I mean, the real successor has not yet been appointed, but there is talk about how the process should unfold. And there is one particular person, Ali Larijani, who's an old hand, who was the right-hand man for security matters of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. He, at some point 20 years ago, he was a nuclear negotiator with the Europeans. So he is an insider, as you can see, and he seems to be pulling the strings in the background. He can also rely on a security service which has not yet shown cracks so far, simply because they know this is an existential, Kabir mentioned this, is an existential moment, not just for the Islamic Republic, but for everyone who stands for it. So really these people, until they are offered some kind of an off-ramp or whatever a deal could look like, they are simply compelled to fight. Similarly, the population has been in a state of war, not only since the crackdown in January, where scores, probably tens of thousands of people were killed in only a couple of days, because once more they took to the streets, and the regime, in this particular situation where it already knew it is under threat from the outside, they simply showed no mercy. They haven't showed no mercy in the past, but this was an extreme case of violence against one's own population. And so now there was a moment, maybe in January, when the protests were going on, the moment when US President Trump promised that help was on its way, where there could have been a direct interplay between an outside attack and the protests on the streets. This moment has gone, at least for now. Right now, people are seeking shelter, fleeing the cities, trying to care for their loved ones, and they are under control of this security services, so they have little means of staging the protest. I mean, truth be told, also Prime Minister Netanyahu said not go on the streets now. They said they should soon go onto the streets, but the idea of how exactly this is going to work out, a kind of continued bombing campaign until the moment that the people can rise up, that's very difficult to imagine. And so thirdly, is this going to be a regime change? Of course, we don't know. We don't know what else has been planned. Trump says that they have just only started to hit hard. The wave, the more heavy waves would be coming. But here is again the question: who is meant to take over from the inside or from the outside, if it were? How can you hold a country which has very many different ethnicities, which has had minority issues, both in terms of repression from the regime, but also in terms of secession inside, secession tendencies? How can you hold this country together when it is just being bombed to oblivion? So this is something where for the moment, I cannot yet see how this is going to play out. And as we heard from Rachel also, it's not even clear whether this is the end goal of the United States.
I would like to ask you a follow-up. And how do you see the role of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps? We haven't talked about that. What are their options right now?
Well, they have the option of being the ones that offer themselves ultimately to someone like President Trump as an alternative to the religious authorities. They are embedded into the system. They are usually called the Praetorian Guard of the Islamic Republic, but they could at least, because they are also involved in the economy, they have construction companies, they control all the smuggling routes. It's like a tentacle of power inside this system, and so they could offer a deal to someone who isn't really interested in regime change. Venezuela has already been mentioned. So if after some time there was a movement in the Revolutionary Guards that they wanted to seize the moment and say, okay, we got rid of the religious elements here, we can now produce a system which can hold the state together, which could be something like a partner to the United States. This is a distinct possibility, and it would definitely be something that the people of Iran did not go to the streets for, because it would be the same kind of terrorizing regime that they had experienced before, except with a different veneer.
Thank you, Cornelius. And I see we already have a couple of questions in the chat, but before I go in the chat, Kabir, I have a question for you. Rachel said that this is not an US war, it is an Israeli war. Do you agree with that assessment? And perhaps you can say something about Israel's role in this war, and how would you describe the strategic importance of this operation for the country?
I think you can even narrow it down even further. It's Netanyahu's war. And this is something that Prime Minister has made no bones about. That one of the greatest threats to the very existence of Israel comes from Iran and comes from the system that is running Iran. I think if you go back to 2012 at the UN with the graphic that he showed, so it had been building for a fair while. It's just the fact that he's found a president in the White House that can be worked, that can be pushed, and can be sort of made to apply in some of the agendas that Israel wants to mobilize against Iran. And if you see it from that perspective, the window is quite small for Netanyahu to get things done. It's something that you can't do it too close to the midterms. It's something that you will not be able to do in the second half or the last half of President Trump's tenure. And as far as windows go, when it comes to sort of strategically sort of pushing the US in doing so, because if you see some of the reports, at least I'm not sure anymore sort of how truthful they are, but at least these are the most of the reports saying that the Israelis basically said that we are going for it. This is the time to sort of strike the supreme leader because we've sort of got the intelligence and so on and so forth, and seems so that the US just followed suit and did see sort of merit in that, because I think without seeing any merit, they will not jump into this phase first. And something similar happened last year as well, where it was an Israeli sort of push and whisper into Trump's ear that they're very close to making 4 to 5 nuclear warheads, and otherwise, if you don't do it right now, they will have that capacities to utilize. That I think push Trump to take that decision that the US should be part of it. So I don't think there's any doubt that this is Israel's core concern. This is Israel's sort of push. If you go back to the early 2000s, the Israeli system made it very clear that yes, Lebanon is an irritant, Syria can be an irritant, Gaza and Hamas can be an irritant, but we have to sort of focus on Iran from a broader term if you want long-term stability and security. And I think we are just seeing fruition of that patience, at least from an Israeli perspective, come into play because the correct person was found in the White House.
Thank you. Let me circle back to the American thinking for a moment. Washington has been sending mixed signals on Iran in recent weeks. On one hand, President Trump has issued repeated threats of military action and even called on the Iranian people to seize their institutions with US backing. And on the other hand, people like Steve Witkoff and J.D. Vance, they have struck a markedly different tone, suggesting a nuclear deal is within reach and that any change in Iran's government is ultimately a matter for Iranians alone. And also yesterday, J.D. Vance said again that regime change is not a priority for the US. So Rachel, I mean, this is a very difficult question, but what explains this apparent incoherence in US foreign policy making at this moment?
I mean, there are just different opinions about these things within the administration. I mean, J.D. Vance is kind of a more through and through isolationist restrainer than Trump is, right? And these voices like J.D. Vance are kind of important and were important in the background of Trump being elected, but they're not really winning the day. In terms of foreign policy, there you have Marco Rubio, who is much more influential, and he is basically still a neocon. I mean, he pretends to be something else, but you can see it in what he cares about and in his actions, and even in his speeches where he's sort of actually really passionate. He still does believe in this idea of using US military force to achieve kind of maybe democracy, but at least kind of more stable situations. And so I think that accounts for the inconsistency. And then Trump himself kind of switches back and forth, right? And that's why you have real inconsistency. If you have a president who gives kind of a very clear line on something, then everyone else follows that line. But Trump, I think, is genuinely ready tomorrow for a deal that seems like a really good deal that he can sell as a win. But also, he can be convinced that the fighting needs to go on for another 10 days to get really a good deal, right? I think he genuinely is not himself sure about the goals. And, he campaigned against regime change wars pretty consistently in 2016 and since. And yet now he is talking about regime change. So he's just fundamentally a little inconsistent on these things. What's true, though, is this is not an administration who's going to be invested in the kind of democratic, just stability of Iran after this war. And that makes it a little easier to start these kinds of operations. Again, I think the Venezuela example is telling, right? They have not pushed for the democratically elected opposition to take over. They went with the pragmatic solution of the people who have the most control of the military, right? And so the option that Cornelius outlined, that it's some kind of like slightly more moderate version of the Republican Guard who has footing in the country and might like a little bit less chant death to Israel and death to the US is fine. In the eyes of this administration. And for example, Trump mentioned kind of wanting to protect the Iranian population. And I think he, in that moment, also genuinely meant it, but not in any kind of real consistent way. You could imagine past presidents or administrations, taking the imminent threat of harm to civilians and the fact that this regime just killed, tens of thousands of civilians, taking that to the Court of Public Appeal and into the realm of international law with a kind of a responsibility to protect argument, right? They didn't even try that. And so, it looks inconsistent because it is inconsistent. I think they genuinely don't know exactly what goal they want to achieve. They're just looking for an exit point that looks like a win. And nobody wants this to last, more than a month, probably not even that long. Trump is not very patient. The Israelis and the Iranians have more patience than he does, and I think that's going to be a conflict.
Thank you, Rachel. So we have two raised hands here, and we have three excellent questions in the chat. I would like to begin with a question from the chat posed by Mayumi Salazar. The question is, I would say, directed to you, Cornelius. How is Europe to react? On the one hand, this intervention is a clear breach of international law, yet the dismantling of the regime is in their interest too. So what are our options?
Well, there aren't so many options as we can see also. I mean, we had a statement by the EU come out, I believe, late on Sunday. So again, it took 1.5 days to coordinate between member states, between the institutions, and what came out was obviously a call to de-escalate, to protect civilians. Nothing which would signal, so I'm not dismissive of the statement per se, but it is what you get when you want the EU to, to say something. But it doesn't signal any active role that the EU intends to play. And I mean, in a war, the EU cannot play a role. It could only be member states. We know this. And again, here there is little incentive to get involved militarily for either of them member states. They all want to protect their citizens, their territory. We had a hit of sort on Cyprus, so that already raises the game a little bit. But in the end, the calculation, if the United States, or once the United States started this war, similar to when they joined Israel's war last summer, there is little the Europeans want to criticize the Americans for, also because there's nothing they can do to stop the Americans, and they know this. And at the same time, and I'm just trying to paint or describe the very bleak picture that the Europeans see, is that they need the Americans for the war that is on Europe's doorstep, or not on Europe's doorstep, but inside Europe, in Ukraine, on the EU's doorstep. They need the Americans for the overall economic picture. That's why we have trade talks with them. So there is, as much as the Europeans would have wanted to pursue a different approach when it comes to Iran, and they did pursue a different approach. Just remind you that it was President Trump who negated the Iran nuclear deal in 2018, which was kind of Europe's prime example of how one can deal with a problem once it arises. So they have, since then, for nearly 10 years now, they have seen that they don't have the instruments to get involved at the level where the United States, but primarily also Israel, is involved.
Thank you. And a question by Mihai Gabriel Krajnicu.
Thank you. So I wanted to point out a question, so to say, in relation to China, because I think China is a very, so to say, important subject. To what extent could a prolonged military escalation in the Middle East fundamentally undermine China's energy security architecture, so to say, given its heavy dependence on Gulf oil imports and maritime choke points such as the Strait of Hormuz? And at the same time, could large-scale instability in the Middle East disrupt China's Belt and Road Initiative corridors? Because we can look at maritime routes and strategic infrastructure investments. Thank you.
Kabir, I would suggest that you maybe have a first try to answer this question.
Right. Okay. I mean, I agree. Look, China is a very important actor, and I think they have released some strong statements condemning the American and Israeli strikes against Iran. But that's very on brand, though. China has always maintained a very strong position against the US's role in the Middle East as an imperial power, as an interventionist power, and so on and so forth. And it's equally interesting that China actually keeps away from any military misadventures in the region or anywhere beyond its immediate interest areas in Asia. But having said that, look, all Asian countries that rely on import of hydrocarbons, that's India, that's China, that's Korea, Japan, are going to have a tough time if this continues. And they are going to have an even tougher time, as I had mentioned previously, if the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, mined for the long term, and the strait in the Red Sea is also the Houthis sort of reignite the Red Sea shipping routes and so on and so forth. Going back, I think a lot of these calculations are not relevant in the US because the US is also a big producer now. So it has a level of energy independence, but countries like India, China, and so on and so forth really don't. They do rely heavily on the Gulf, and the only sort of thing about the China would be interesting about China is that previously they have tried to play the mediator's role as well. The normalization between Saudi Arabia and Iran was done under the Chinese umbrella. Well, the Chinese are sort of given it as a gift. I don't think they did too much of mediation themselves, but other than that, they actually also hosted talks between Hamas and Fatah. So, they have been sort of trying to have a slightly bigger role to play in the Middle East. But I think there is a strong realization, even in China, and slight worry that anything deeper can get obfuscated and force them to choose sides, which they usually do. They are mostly pro-Arab rather than trying to balance it with Israel and so on and so forth. I think they have a terrible relationship with Israel these days. Now, beyond the hydrocarbons and energy security thing, the Belt and Road Initiative, look, I don't think that's too much of a concern as far as the Middle East go. In Central Asia, they're much more sort of ingrained, where their own money is ingrained. But in the Middle East, I don't think they've poured in billions and billions in developing infrastructure and so on and so forth. I think it's more about connecting between like-minded countries and partners and trying to build sort of highways that streamline trade more than anything else. I think the Saudis are part of it, the Emiratis are part of it, and so are other Gulf countries. But if it was anything, I think starkly different as far as Chinese calculations were concerned, I think you would see a much more active Beijing than you have seen in the past. But the Chinese are well versed with this idea that they should keep two arms length distance when regional infractions are being played out, because I don't think there's a win for any other country in Asia to try and resolve this, quote unquote.
Just
Sure.
very briefly on this, one other aspect that is potentially relevant for China, not the energy, but the U.S. Air defense systems and the depletion of U.S. air defense systems is potentially, let's say, interesting for China in this regard, if it were thinking about some kind of action towards Taiwan or just in general. This is something that people in the U.S. who are very concerned about more or less imminent conflict with China are very worried about, have been worried about for even previous to this, and we are seeing a depletion of Israeli, regional, and U.S. Air defense capabilities every day.
Great, thank you. So we have a next question from Bayuntu Samba. Floor is yours.
Hi, good morning. This is Bayu from the Indonesian Embassy in Berlin. I just have one question. Will Chancellor Merz's visit to the US result in more engagement from Germany and the E3 in the conflict? Maybe Rachel and Cornelius have something to say about this. Thank you.
I'm going to go with no. What do you think, Cornelius?
I'm going to agree. I think sorry, I'm just continue and then you add, Rachel. I think the options for the German government are pretty much set, and getting involved. There was a news item, I believe, on Sunday at some point, Monday, maybe it was yesterday. Days are a bit fluid. That on the Israeli radio saying that Germany would join the fight, and this has been adamantly and officially refused or refuted. So what Chancellor Merz will try to do is to be, a friendly ally, a good ally. Germany has tried to be in good standing in Washington. So we already heard what he said when it comes to the ongoing conflict itself. But then he will try to tackle the issues that really matter to Germany, and that's tariffs, that's Ukraine. So that's where I see things going during this visit. Rachel?
No, I agree. I think because they also are conflicted, right? It's not a case where they're fundamentally really opposed to this, but also have limited means. They have very limited means to influence, and also they're themselves a bit conflicted about the action, which is to say, slightly supportive, although they also see the complications.
Thank you for that assessment. And we have another question here by Max Gotthans.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Max Gottans from Internationale Politik. I have a question regarding the role of the Houthi in the conflict. We have not read so many things about them reacting to it so far. And I wonder how much is the influence of the regime currently on the Houthi, because sometimes they are conceptualized as a proxy, but I don't really think that this is the case. They have a certain influence, but yeah, I wonder if this influence also weakens by the regime being bombed right now. And also, which role would the US play in that situation, since they are the ones opposing the Houthi recently? Yeah, would be interested in that.
Great question. So first, perhaps Kabir and then Rachel on the US.
Yeah, thanks. Look, on the Houthis, one thing you're absolutely right that there's this perception that sort of all groups, let's say within the construct of the axis of resistance that the Iranians propagate, are completely beholden to Iranian interests. I don't think that's how it works. They all have distinct political identities and political aims. They'd all benefit from the money, the weapons, and the trainings that the Iranians are able to impart. But they do have their independent stance on multiple things. We have seen this in the past where they do such kind of groups, not necessarily the Houthis, but they do break ranks and negotiate with third parties and fourth parties that may not benefit the Iranians. And if you go back to some of the interviews the Iranians themselves have given, including Minister Arakchi and so on and so forth, they attest to this. They do say that, look, we are like-minded, but they do have their identities, and sometimes they just don't work for us. They just work for themselves. So it's like a 50-50 kind of thing. You're funding them, hoping that at least partly they're able to sustain your interest in that part of the world in whichever format they are operating. And if you go back, I remember in 2015 when Yemen was on the boil once again, the Houthis were basically a ragtag militia, and I know this because India did mass evacuation out of Djibouti, and I think we were one of the only few countries that were able to fly into Sana'a. And fly people out. And you talk to diplomats who sort of arrange that entire arrangement. And the Houthis were quite different to the ones that you see on television and on screens today, with the fatigues and the weaponization and so on and so forth. Back then, it was, for lack of a better term, again, traditional militia, sort of not having much, but having that idea and ideology really sustaining them. And sort of just very quickly, segueing off, I think that's a very important part of understanding Iran's outreach and Iran's sort of systems that function. The ideology part is very strong. It's not just something that's papered on, or it's not something that's sort of just on the surface of things. When they do sort of construct these militias or try to sort of prop them up, the ideology part is the first mover. It's how they convince them to be attached to the Iranian system and the Iranian interests. And I say this from the example in Afghanistan, where a lot of Shias from Afghanistan actually fought for the Iranians and died in Syria. And they had nothing. They didn't get paid too much and so on and so forth. The entire mobilization of I think it was called the Zubayon Brigade or the Fatamayon Brigade, one of those two. And the entire mobilization of that happened purely on ideological basis. It was barely any money. It was barely any sort of returns on that kind of institution. So the ideology part and the religion part are extremely important when we are discussing these kind of systems being mobilized, or when we are discussing sort of what comes next in Iran as far as systemization goes.
Just briefly on the Houthi US, I mean, this is a example. Both actors then have to consider kind of how much they're willing to escalate. As Kabir said, the Houthis will have their own interests in this, right? The more they kind of escalate on their side, the more they become potentially a target for Israel or US strikes. So that will be on the side of their calculation, how much they want to push it. But it's also, the more the Houthis escalate, the more it becomes kind of messier for the US. And so basically, the answer is I don't know what the decision will be on either side. The US, Trump already kind of ended the conflict with the Houthis somewhat prematurely the first time, right? He thought it would be kind of easy to decimate them, determined that it wasn't going to be as easy as he thought, and then ended with a compromise of, well, just don't attack our ships, right? And so I think I would expect something similar, right? There's not going to be a willingness to invest tons to really decimate the Houthis. On the other hand, if the Houthis insist on entering the conflict to a really high level, then they're going to draw some level of attention. But it's beyond that, it's hard to say.
Thank you. And I would like to add a question from the chat because it fits nicely with the discussion. It's by Levi Schmitz, and he asks, how big of a role do you think play Iranian proxies in other countries to widen the war? We talk now about the Houthis, but we haven't talked about Hezbollah yet. So what are the chances of them to achieve this by taking, for example, hostages of American embassies, and how would their part change or intensify if the regime falls? So this is also a question on the future of the so-called axis of resistance. Cornelius, perhaps you would like to start.
Yes, happy to. And as you said, it fits nicely into the previous discussion. So that there's always been a degree of reliance that the Islamic Republic had on its so-called proxies. It's true that especially in Western media or Western policy circles, all these groups, many of them begin with an H: Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthis, that they would be somehow the extended arm of the Islamic Republic. But as Kabir already said, they have their own interests. The one that has been most closely aligned with Tehran is the Hezbollah in Lebanon. It was actually founded by the Islamic Republic in the early 1980s, just after Israel had attacked Lebanon. So it was the export of the revolution. It's also a Shiite militia, contrary to Hamas, which is mainly Sunni. So there is a degree that the regime in Tehran can rely upon them. And we've seen in the past conflict last summer, where many in Tehran were hoping that Hezbollah would enter the fray, that this didn't happen. Now we've seen Hezbollah launch some strikes on Israel, to which Israel responded because it had prepared for this. But immediately the Lebanese government said that anything that the military wing of Hezbollah is doing is illegal. So trying to put a stop to this, and this could also be in the interest of Hezbollah because they want to remain in Lebanon. They are a force, a political party, a charity. They are a force inside Lebanon, and most likely they don't want to die with the regime in Tehran now. So that is something where the might of the proxies, as it was called maybe in the past, is much diminished, not just militarily, for example, through the campaign against Hamas, but also ideologically. There is much less cohesion apparently now than was previously assumed.
Thank you. Kabir, would you like to add to that?
Very briefly, look, even Hezbollah, as Cornelius rightly pointed out, which was created specifically sort of by Iran in the 1980s with specific aims and so on and so forth, was really, really not too eager to join the campaign post October 2023 with Hamas. It took a lot of convincing, a lot of time for Hezbollah to open the northern front and to mobilize as a cohesive unit with Hamas. Why? Because over the period of that time, yes, if you go back to their founding, it was direct sort of creation of Iran, but over the time they have evolved. They've become a political entity as well. They have to see their own sort of survival within the Lebanese system, and they don't want to jeopardize their very existence for the long term, for short-term kinetic aims that the Iranians may have or the Hamas may have, that really don't fit well into their long-term aims. So I think that's just it's a good example to show that even though they were created for a specific reason, their political evolution did happen along with their ideological evolution as a separate entity.
Thank you. We've covered really a lot of ground in the early hours of today, and we are down to our last 5 minutes. Before we close, I'd like to ask each of you for a final thought on what lies ahead. I would suggest we go in reverse order from the opening remarks, starting with you, Cornelius. In your view, and given everything that we've discussed today, what's sort of the best case scenario from here, and what's the worst?
Well, it's hard to think around about a best case scenario if the options are what they are, where we have no clear goals from the at least one of the partners that started this war. Israel may have much clearer goals, but where we don't even see a kind of strategic military campaign. So, I mean, describing the best case comes down to wishful thinking that somehow this war topples the regime, and from the ashes of the regime emerges a democratic and rights-abiding and law-abiding Iranian state. I don't see this as an easy achievement, especially not the way it is conducted right now. The worst case would be that not just the regime falls apart, but the governing authority falls apart, that Iran is dismembered, that there is some sort of a civil war that is being started, whether from outside or from the inside, that doesn't matter in the end, but that we have a maximized Syria case, Syria after 2011, but at the center between Middle East, Europe, and Asia. So that would be the worst case.
Thank you, Rachel.
So before I go to the best or worst case, I think something that's really interesting to highlight for a German audience is I was just recently rereading the National Defense Strategy because I have a very fun and exciting life. And in there, they actually mention Israel as the model ally of the United States because it is an ally who can kind of take control of its own security and has a lot of capacity on its own. So I think it's just worth thinking about a vision of national defense in the US context where a country like Israel, who has identified its, primary threat, has put itself in a situation through different actions in the past few years of, the proxies being existentially weakened and Iran itself being weakened, and taken advantage of the fact that Russia isn't able to come to Iran's aid right now to potentially really dramatically change its security situation. All very risky. Who knows if that's going to happen? But I think that's something interesting to think about from a German and European perspective of what does it mean to be a model ally to this administration, at least. Interestingly, the sort of worst case scenario for the Democrats is a scenario in which there is some kind of relatively quick exit from this with a different but related regime in power that can really be in power, but that's kind of moderated, maybe along a kind of Saudi model, right? So they can pursue relationship with Israel that's, complicated but pragmatic, and doesn't have the same, isn't democratic, is, relatively repressive, but can have kind of a productive relationship with Israel and the United States and achieve a certain amount of stability, which, might be one of the better options also in the short term for the Iranian people. And this is certainly possible, right? I mean, I don't know if that's enough for Netanyahu, which is the potential complication there. And no one can assure that there's not going to be some kind of greater escalation. But that's absolutely what the Trump administration is hoping for. That's the big win that they're hoping to get from this. But they don't actually control the next steps as fully as they think that they might or hope that they might. So there's a worst case scenario that's at least as likely, I think, which is continued escalation, both from the Iranians and then from the Israeli-US side, and a really fundamental regional destabilization that'll be bad for everyone involved. Oh, sorry. I mean, importantly, in the other good solution is you would have then a relaxation of the sanctions regime, and that would actually be pretty good for the Iranian people in the medium term. So, I mean, there's a world in which this ends up being a very big win, and that's absolutely what they're hoping.
Thank you. And Kabir, over to you. You have the last words.
Look, I really don't like crystal ball gazing on the Middle East. It's too precarious to sort of stick in any shape or form. But I think the bigger problem here is that all of this that has happened in the past 48 to 72 hours is reliant on a lot of hope. And I think that's not a good strategy. I don't think that's a strategy at all. And that's a fundamental problem, because often we are hearing about this sort of, and I think there is at some level in the US, this got ingrained that what they did in Venezuela was so good that it can be replicated in other parts of the world. It's Iran is starkly different to anything that happened in Venezuela. But anyway, that's more of a tactical crisis, and that's already happened. Now, in what's coming after this, unfortunately, I think anytime you're sort of intervening into a system, hoping to engineer change, you need to have a level of political mobilization that you can tap into on the ground. Change will not come through air power. It will not come through air campaigns. Unfortunately, I don't see any of that political galvanization on the ground. So when someone is telling you that, oh, it's now up to the people, which seems to be the stated policy, at least coming from President Trump, I don't think, Ali walking down the road in Tehran can go into the palace and become the president. So you need much more cohesion on tapping into a political either opposition or a counter movement. Even the 79 revolution was taken over by Khamenei's protesters, but it was a students' movement, right? So you need something to tap into to sort of help it flower, and then maybe some kind of political reality can come into play that you can work with. But I don't see that happening. What I do see is the potential of a new Ayatollah being announced, because they were prepared something like this may happen, and we are all sort of back to square one, just with a much more precarious Middle East when it comes to the relationship between the Gulf, Iran, and Israel, the three poles of power that basically decide which direction the region is going to go in.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of today's special morning briefing. Thank you to our three speakers for their insights, especially at such short notice. And thank you to everyone in the audience for joining us and your questions, of course. We'll be back next week with a regular morning briefing. Until then, goodbye and have a good day. Bye-bye.